So, all right. So, 1920s was a great time. Roaring. That is the right chapter, right? 1920s. So it's chapter 20. And, okay, good. It's like, oh. So we go into the 20s thinking we've just had enough sacrifice and difficulty from World War I, plus we've just finished the Progressive Era. And, you know, we just wanted to fix stuff in the Progressive Era. So we're kind of done with fixing stuff for a while. So the 20s, it's really just supposed to be about getting back to normal, or as Harding would call it, normalcy. However, it's probably not quite normal by the end of the day. Well, honestly, I don't know when, you know, our times are normal, but 20s is full of extreme growth, economic growth, but it's really unregulated or unchecked. So it grows in a way that is kind of destined to, you know, it's kind of a what goes up must come down sort of thing. So, so it does, but it comes down in a pretty bad way, as you know, because we end up with a Great Depression, which was not great, but instead really long. So I know I said I was going to stop taking a roll, but here I did it again. Okay, so let me share the notes with you. We'll talk about this a little bit. Okay. Oh, it'd be better if you just saw the one page, right? Could do that. All right. I feel like I can make that bigger. I think the make it bigger thing is over here where these pictures are. Oh, there it is. Sorry, I'm really having trouble with something. A lot of things today, huh? Okay, so lots of things kind of mark the culture of the 20s. Excess is probably one of those things, which is kind of funny because it's in the middle of Prohibition. Prohibition starts on the, I think it starts in 1919 with the 18th Amendment. Excuse me, or maybe it starts in 1920, because you have to have the Volstead Act to enforce it. But I know it ends in 1933, because it's one of those things that FDR promises when he runs for president in 32. It's not why he won, but it didn't hurt, I'm sure. Excuse me. But it's not just prosperity, it's culture fights, lots of culture fights in the 20s. And, you know, I've been kind of fascinated looking at the things that have happened this year about how many of those things kind of look like flu pandemic of 1919, some of the cultural issues that we had in the 20s. I think some of it's kind of interesting how much it compares, and hopefully not a Great Depression that follows. We haven't had one of those since then, so hopefully we won't do that as well. Although what a strange year. We've done a lot of things that no one really thought we would do. Plus, over the weekend, my brother's favorite baseball player died, and I think that's probably going to cap it off for him in 2020. It's Bob Gibson. I'm sure he's probably a favorite of yours as well. My brother really likes baseball. All right, Sackler and Vanzetti probably did not, so we should probably get back to the 20s. And Bob Gibson was old, but he didn't play in the 20s. Excuse me. So, Sackler and Vanzetti really does reveal the issues of race and culture and justice that are part of the issues of the 1920s. And you'll see lots of important court cases and rulings in the 20s as well. And sorry, let me scroll down to see if there's a separate Sackler and Vanzetti. Nope, not really. Okay. So I'll talk about that for just a second. So These guys were immigrants from Italy, and they were somewhat anarchist, which also seems a lot like some of the things we see in the news right now as well. And the anarchists really want to bring down the system or the government, and they use different methods. Sometimes it's violent. In the 20s, it tended to be, like you see a little bit now with some activists, but their goal really was to change the culture in the government or to eliminate an overall either federal government or local government, kind of depended on where the anarchists were and where they were from. But one of these guys really was much less involved in anarchy than the other, but they get arrested for robbing a paymaster at a shoe factory and robbing and killing him, which they didn't do. They weren't guilty of that. But because they were anarchists and immigrants who wanted to make changes rather than assimilate, which is really what we expected of immigrants during that era, even when they found out that these guys had been falsely accused, that evidence had been planted, that people had been paid to testify against them, and they had been sentenced to death, we still carried out the death sentence, even though millions of people protested worldwide. And part of the reason we were comfortable as a society doing that, and there were some protests in the US as well, but this was more of an international outcry about this. Oh, sorry. Oh, gosh. We felt justified in executing them because they were just bad. They were anarchists who wanted to bring down the system, and we didn't need people like that. So we weren't really concerned about guilt or innocence necessarily. Fairly important guy. You could probably read about him for your book review. Felix Frankfurter, which is kind of a cool name. He's an Austrian immigrant, and he is Jewish, but agnostic. So ethnically Jewish, not a practicing Jew. He is one of the early founders of the ACLU, and he will write a really long article in the Atlantic magazine that explains why we should have no business executing Sacco and Vanzetti. And that article doesn't, it's not terribly persuasive apparently, but later on, he'll be on the Supreme Court and he'll be involved in a fairly important case that we'll talk about. So Sacco, one of them gives a speech before they execute him where he says that if he doesn't think that what's going on is fair, but if he had to go back and do it again, he wouldn't do anything different. So didn't feel like anything that he had done really led to his execution. And also, goodness, can't remember what else I was going to say about Sacco and Vanzetti. Class is going to be good today, isn't it? So they gave the speech, executed. I can't remember what else I was going to say, but I'll think of it and tell you next time, maybe. Probably not. All right, other stuff that happens in the 20s. Oh, I know what I was going to tell you. The judge kept saying stuff can't like, and I'll clean it up, of course. Which, should a historian clean it up? I don't know, I'm sorry. But the judge keeps saying, can we just hurry up and convict these darn Italian immigrants? So the judge says some pretty racist stuff during the trial as well. It shows that he has a prejudice against them, either for their ethnicity or their political views, honestly, probably both. But there were lots of reasons to overturn the verdict, and the Supreme Court was unconcerned during that era. Things that happened in the 20s, the automobile industry is crucially important, really a big deal. So it really is kind of the focus of the economy during this era. And anything related to the automobile financially, is going to do really well. Your book also talks about how in this era, people started to want more choices. They didn't necessarily want all the cars to look exactly the same. So you start to see other companies besides Ford doing well. The book particularly mentions General Motors. And Ford is going to go international. They'll have a plant in Brazil. I think the plant in Brazil really is supposed to help produce tires and rubber for the automobile industry. It's near the rainforest, of course it is. And the giant plant, Ford plant in River Rouge, Michigan is, I think the statistics on that say that once it's at full production, that it produces one car every, it's like 90 seconds. Now that doesn't mean, of course, that it took them 90 seconds to make a car, but once they got up to speed, they were producing really quickly. And of course, part of what Ford wants to do is create the democratized automobile so everyone can afford it. So people buy cars, whether they can afford them or not, because you can pay them out over time. So the 20s is really kind of the era where we start really getting into credit a little bit. So we start buying a whole lot of stuff we don't need because we can just pay X number of dollars a month and eventually we'll have it paid off, which is kind of an American thing to do, I suppose. Restaurants, roads, steel, glass, rubber, petroleum products, those industries boom. People didn't really go to restaurants before this era. They don't go to like the way we do. I don't know if we go right now, but a year ago today, people didn't eat out that much in this era. You know, if you could walk to the restaurant, now you can drive to the restaurant, so you might go locally. Now in the 50s is where you have the drive-through kind of thing, drive-in restaurants, but these are still the old-fashioned sit-down kind of restaurants. And all those other things relate to car production. So we increase our mobility and independence. There's a teen culture. Now, this is not really the era where everybody's teen kid gets a car, but on the weekends, you let the teen borrow the car. So on the weekends, they're kind of off doing their own thing, which everyone assumes is bad because, you know, now that teens don't have close supervision from their parents, they're off doing, well, they're up to no good is what it is. And when you first start seeing all those editorials about how teens are irresponsible, they cause all the problems in the country, really is the 20s. So the 20s really is the development of teen culture. So automobiles lead to independence, a little more travel, expansion of certain economic sectors, and people really do think, and I think we kind of feel this way a little bit, that the stock market will always just go up. Now I realize this year, you know, I have a retirement account, so when you get older, you pay a little more attention to the stocks, I suppose. They've really been up and down. There have been huge fluctuations this year. But the stock market, you know, historically after the 20s has just continued to rise. In the 20s, the assumption was it would rise forever, and that if there were corrections, they would be temporary. So if it would go back, if it would go down, it would go back up again pretty quickly. The industries that don't do well during this era have to do with agriculture, so food and textiles, and farming, because we're not selling overseas anymore. And the 20s is really a pro-business era where the business and manufacturers, business, manufacturers, government really work together. And the government passes laws that are supposed to be helpful to business. They're supposed to work in partnership. So less regulation, less concern about the workers, and more concern about profitability. I feel like I talked about some of this stuff last time, so apologize if this is a little bit of a review. Now, you're wondering, do people's rights expand in the 20s? No. Well, maybe. I don't know. I do know. Okay, so workers, not so much. Unions are on the decline during this era. The big union that still is visible is the AFL. The IWW is definitely on the decline because that's a bunch of foreigners that, are anarchists and cause world wars. So there's not in favor of those folks. Plus, we deported a lot of their leaders during the Red Scare, which I suppose we'll talk about here in a minute. The ERA, they tried to pass during this time period because the thought is women could vote. Maybe it's time to give them equal rights. We'll try to pass the ERA 3 times in our history. 2 of the times are probably not when you would expect them to be. One is the 20s, the other is the 50s, and then we'll try again in the 70s. And we're 0 for 3 on that. And it really just says that there will not be discrimination based on sex. Very short amendment. Excuse me, in the modern era, I don't know that we'll try this for a 4th time, but the thought is in the modern era, 14th Amendment takes care of this, and since you've seen courts rule favorably using the 14th Amendment, that perhaps the ERA isn't necessary. However, there's certainly still a push in some sectors for this. So it's proposed and rejected in the 20s. What you do see is flapper culture, which is influential but not majority. And I'm sure we've talked about cultural stuff before. A lot of times the stuff that's in popular culture, younger people pay more attention to it. It tends to make a lot of money for a small group of people, maybe fashion designers or entertainers, movie makers, musicians, that sort of thing. But, oh, goodness. It probably doesn't dramatically affect the way the average person lives. So younger folks are, maybe going to dress like flappers. They're going to go out and party some, but once they get married, they're going to be fairly traditional. So yeah, flapper image, young women who exemplify female liberation, shorter skirts. The Charleston dance is kind of an example of how they looked and how they dressed. The shorter hair, the bobbed hairstyle. They did drink and smoke in public, which I know, prohibition, but upper middle class folks drank, and it was kind of trendy to break the law. And that's sort of a new thing culturally as well, where it becomes trendy to break the law. And flappers tend to be middle class, kind of upper middle class, urban, single women. And once they marry, they flap less. So women did tend to remain fairly conservative, but because of the public image, you sort of got the impression that more women behaved like this than they probably did. And what else do we want to say about flappers? It does sort of suggest that society itself has become more liberal, which it probably has. There's, more statistics that back that up. But still, the vast majority of people live very, very conservative lives in this era. And you don't really see the big cultural change where, women are really pushing for careers and they don't get married as early and they have kids. They don't necessarily, they don't necessarily get married to have kids. And birth control, pills and things like that. You don't really see that sort of women's liberation till the 60s or 70s. And what goes along with that also is an increase in divorce rates. I'm not blaming it at all. It's just, this is still an era in the 20s where you didn't get divorced, even if you would, have a good reason, like, some sort of abuse or addiction, those sorts of things. And I'm not trying to be judgmental at all. So, I mean, if society viewed as a good reason, because, you know, what you would view in your relationship is different, of course, but than what society would view. But in this era, even if there was abuse or addiction in your marriage, you still probably stayed married. And we don't really change that cultural norm until 60s, honestly, probably 70s. So you'll read some stuff that talk about how people are more promiscuous during the 20s and more likely to get divorced. And that's true, but still 85 to 90% of people in the United States did not, I mean, like just something like 10 to 12% of people did get divorced. Most people did not. And that'll stay pretty steady for a long time. Business of America is business. You'll hear President Calvin Coolidge will say that. He'll say, the business of America is business, and what's good for General Motors is good for America. So this is not a decade of reform, for sure. It's also not a decade for Democrats. They're out. And the Wall Street Journal is a good quote from your book. Never before has a government been so completely fused with business. Oh, excuse me, sorry. While Harding became synonymous with corruption, Coolidge really became synonymous with prosperity, as did Herbert Hoover, who was the Secretary of Commerce throughout this decade. Harding's administration was really corrupt. The Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, loaned government land to Teapot Dome and Elk Hills, and these are in Wyoming and California, so that companies could harvest the oil. Something similar had been done, of course, during the Taft administration. But what was different here is that rather than giving the money to the government, Albert Fall accepted or kept a lot of the money. It was kind of it wasn't kind of, it was an off the books deal. And there were millions of dollars exchanged. So Albert Fall ends up getting convicted and going to jail. And it looks like maybe Harding started to look like Harding was involved. And then Harding died. So he dies in office. And probably of a heart attack, maybe of a stroke. There was always a little suggestion that maybe his wife poisoned him. He apparently dated a lot, shall we say. I can remember when I taught high school 100 years ago, and I used it was kind of an interesting textbook, and there was a quote in the chapter about the 20s where Warren G. Harding's dad told him that if he'd been a woman, he'd have been in the family way all the time. He'd have been pregnant all the time. So apparently he was, even his dad thought he was a little overly promiscuous. Apparently his wife agreed. I'm not saying she killed him. There's no good evidence to suggest that. And I think they actually exhumed his body to look for toxins and didn't find them. But somebody had free time at the coroner's office, because that was like 50 years later. All right. So Harding dies. Coolidge is his vice president and takes over, and then he takes over and then serves another term. Yeah. So Republicans are in charge all through the 20s, so they're giving credit for the prosperity of the era. The government continues this laissez-faire type of economic policy, and that really just means leave it alone. So very little government regulation. This is beyond libertarianism. This is, again, where the government works in concert with businesses to try to help businesses earn more money. Foreign policy focuses on trade and economics, and colonialism ensures that the British and the US control lots of natural resources. The natural resource we're most interested in during this era is oil, petroleum products. We have some, there's more in the Middle East. Well, it's not necessarily that there's more. it's easier to get to. One of the Supreme Court cases of the era that's important is the Schenck case. And, oh, sorry, IV problems there. The Schenck case is the one about free speech. And Schenck was an activist who encouraged people not to register for the draft during World War I. So he's arrested and convicted under espionage and sedition acts. And he says that this is a limit of his freedom of speech. And of course, the original intent of the First Amendment is political speech. So he says, you know, this was the whole goal. Why are you guys trying to punish me for what the First Amendment protects? So the Supreme Court, I think it's Oliver Wendell Holmes, says that your speech is not protected. I think he wrote the majority ruling is what I'm saying. Your speech is not protected if it presents a clear and present danger. And it's like shouting fire, falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater. So we get this nice two phrases from the Schenck case, which does say that the government has a constitutional ability to limit free speech in times of clear and present danger. Now, I think I know that we still follow that ruling in some ways. We've just really modified what we think is a clear and present danger, or what seems like shouting fire. So the idea that, you know, you would encourage someone not to sign up for the draft, or there would be anti-government speech, I'm fairly sure would not get you in trouble in the modern era. I think we sort of expect that in the modern era, and not about the draft, of course. I know we don't draft anymore, or haven't for a long time. But there are other things, you know, Patriot Act, that sort of thing, where we do regulate or at least explore your private communications on the off chance that you maybe want to harm the government. Okay, I'm going to pause for just a second and see if I have missed any questions. Doesn't look like it. All right. Do you guys have any questions? Is there anything you want to ask? Looks like more of you have joined. So, but I do think I'll pause at the end and look at the attendance again there. So that way you don't have to watch it on the video. By the way, yeah, you guys don't watch the videos, do you? I know, I look at the statistics sometimes to see if anybody's watched them, so. But you're here, so why would you? Yeah, no, if you're absent, no, it makes sense. And most of you guys are pretty good about attending, except those, like 2 or 3 people we never see. We could talk about them now, but no, we should talk again about the history. All right, so back to the history. All right, religion is big during this era, really big. And if you are old like me, which you are not, but you will be someday, hopefully. When I was a kid, I grew up in the Midwest, and we went to church all the time. Like, I have friends who think that I go like too much because I go every week. Back when I was a kid, you went 3 times a week. Can you imagine 3 times a week? But it's just what we did. You know, it's just what was kind of culturally accepted in the place where I lived. And I think now I've read some statistics on church attendance, because apparently I have free time and read weird things. But people who attend church a lot in their own estimation probably go once or twice a month in the modern era. Yeah, I know people, honestly, I do know people who go 5 or 6 times a week still, but they are older. Somebody mentioned that grandparents do that. My husband's dad goes to Mass early so he can pray the rosary, and he's an hour early on Sundays, but I bet he goes 3 or 4 times a week too. So, I mean, it's good. It is good. I'm not saying it isn't, but that's unusual. It kind of stands out in the modern era. During this time period, it was expected that you went to church. However, there were new values, and people were talking about science during this time period, and people started to feel like there was a conflict between science and religion. And the place that you saw that the most in this era, and you probably still see it, I know that you still see it because I taught in public school forever, is the debate over how life began, evolution. So by then, the theories of Charles Darwin were published and starting to become a little bit mainstream, at least in science classes. So the idea of evolution, either macro or micro, I think everybody's okay with microevolution, where things adapt because of environment and that sort of thing, but macro, beginning of life kind of stuff, Big Bang theory, that sort of idea, not the TV show, don't get excited there. So the state of Tennessee, in the state of Tennessee, they passed the Butler Act, which said you couldn't teach evolution in public school. It's like Kansas or Texas when we adopt a new biology book. I know when my friends would get super excited because their kids were going to read this biology book that talked about evolution, I said, there are two problems that I think you don't realize. Thing number one, your kids aren't reading their biology book because they don't read their textbooks. So sorry to tell you that. And thing number two, they probably talk about evolution in a biology class for 30 minutes at the most in an entire year. But we get really excited about it. During this era, we did get really, they didn't teach us much in science. They didn't know as many things maybe, but it really is about, did God create the universe, or did, I don't know, some particles, people got really excited about it. So the Butler Law was passed. They really didn't anticipate arresting people for teaching evolution. They really just passed the Butler Law as a statement because Butler wanted other legislators and his constituents to know that he loved God more than they did, or that he was the most godly guy you could vote for. And that worked in rural Tennessee, which was all of Tennessee during this time period. So to get elected, you wanted to be the most spiritual guy. So Butler is just showing that he's the most spiritual guy. They really didn't intend to enforce it, except some guy in the ACLU, a guy named George Rapalea, thought that he was a student activist and thought it would be a good idea to test the law. And the ACLU was trying to get, he was a student ACLU member. The ACLU was trying to get someone to break the law and teach evolution. So he said he would find someone. He found his old college buddy, John Scopes. And Scopes was a football coach, but the biology teacher was out for some reason, so he was covering for the biology teacher. So George asked John, hey, will you teach evolution? And he goes, I don't know anything about it. And so he gave him the book, Darwin's Origin of the Species, and said, hey, just read this to your students, and that'll be teaching evolution. So he took it, and he read it to them. And then, the ACLU told him, like, we're going to try to get you arrested, and we'll get a really good lawyer for you, because we want to test the law in the courts. And so he agreed to it, and he taught evolution, and they went to the school board and said, hey, you should arrest him, have him arrested because he taught evolution. They went, yeah, not our biggest problem, we don't care. And then they went to the police department and said, you need to arrest him, he taught evolution. And they also said, not our biggest problem, we don't care. But they were insistent, so they eventually got John Scopes arrested. And then they had a trial, which had like a big carnival atmosphere to it. There were like kids' rides, and there were people with banners and people selling stuff. And they put a big banner on the courthouse that said, read your Bible daily. They reenact this every year as well in Dayton, Tennessee. I think it's Dayton, Tennessee. It got news coverage. Probably the most famous reporter of the day would be a radio reporter. H.L. Mencken covered the trial and kind of made fun of, not kind of, he did make fun of the people and their conservative values and proclaimed fundamentalism, a literal belief in the Bible, to be dead, which clearly you live in the middle of the country, so you know it isn't. But the ACLU lawyer was a guy named Clarence Darrow, who was the most famous defense attorney of the day, and really interesting kind of guy. He would take cases where he could make millions of dollars. He would take cases where he worked for free. This would be one where he worked for free. And he really was a strangely principled lawyer. And I don't mean that lawyers aren't principled. I mean that his goal, he really had a pretty, what do I want to say about Clarence Darrow? He really fought hard to get his clients relieved of what he thought would be unfair punishment. So, like in this case, any punishment would be unfair. He thought the law was just wrong, so that's why he took this case. There'll be another case where he takes, these two guys were guilty of killing a little boy, and they were, goodness. But he gets them, his goal in their case, it's in Chicago. It was Leopold and Loeb. His goal in their case is to make sure they don't get the death penalty, because he said that they were raised with improper values. So they didn't really see right and wrong the same way that other people did. So I don't know, he's an interesting lawyer. But anyway, back to the case, sorry. He's going to argue that you have the right, freedom of expression, freedom of intellect, freedom of academic expression. And then the state of Tennessee is going to get William Jennings Bryan, who's kind of old at this point, but you remember him running for president in 1896, perhaps. And he had been Secretary of State during the Woodrow Wilson era, so he's a pretty well-known guy as well. So he's going to argue on behalf of the Bible, and he'll give a big speech about how the Bible is important in modern culture and shouldn't be swept aside. And Clarence Darrow will cross-examine him as an expert on the Bible and kind of make him look foolish. But there's a movie about it called Inherit the Wind. And the movie's moderately interesting. No, it's really, actually, it's kind of a good movie for an old movie, but it is not accurate. Not accurate, because it adds in characters that didn't exist and stuff, but it's a really good movie. And it also kind of portrays William Jennings Bryan as not very smart, and he dies right at the end of the trial, which is much more dramatic than what really happens, because he doesn't die at the end of the trial. But anyway, when the trial is over, Scopes is found guilty of teaching evolution, which is what they expected, and the ACLU vows to fight it all the way to the Supreme Court. It gets to the appellate court in Tennessee and then stops there because they ruled that because the judge had given the penalty, which was a $100 fine, that the penalty was improper, and they threw out the verdict. So the county, Dayton County, would have to retry the case, and they said, no, we're not having any of that. They also mentioned Billy Sunday, who's also an interesting guy. He had been kind of a rogue baseball player in the Ty Cobb sort of mold, but then became a super religious fundamentalist preacher kind of guy. And so he went around doing revivals, which was pretty trendy during this time period. So religion is big, in spite of what H.L. Mencken said. It really doesn't die during this era. And Protestants are more likely to be in favor of prohibition than Catholics, which leads to the KKK disliking Protestants. So KKK has a renaissance during this time period. You'll see the KKK really big after Civil War, and it's big again in the 20s when there's this anti-immigrant push, and then it's big again once you see the civil rights movement starting, so 50s and 60s. And then somebody will sue them in the 80s, early 80s, and bankrupt them. So that's part of the reason the KKK doesn't matter as an organization anymore in a big way, because they were actually a corporation and they got sued and they got bankrupted. So, which is interesting, perhaps. It's how we break you down. In the United States, we sue you and take all your money. So the KKK, their push during this era was 100% Americanism, anti-communism, assimilation. So they have a literal march on Washington. I think they have about 50,000 people who march in their robes. They're also concerned. Leo Frank is a Jewish fellow who is tried for killing a little girl named Mary Fagan, who works at a pencil factory. He works at a pencil factory. She works there. She's about 12 or 13. And they find her raped and killed near an elevator. Turns out the person who did it was a maintenance guy. But they convict Leo Frank because he's the only Jewish person that works there, or they put him on trial. The judge ends up tossing out the verdict because he decides that people came to just on the basis of Leo Frank being Jewish and that there was evidence someone else had done this. And then the KKK goes to the jail where he's being held before he's let out and lynches him. So, and they make up songs about it and stuff. It's pretty gruesome stuff. So the KKK wants to restrict forces, any force that they think endangers American civilization, which is whatever they think it is: assimilation, Protestant Christianity, getting rid of alcohol, that sort of stuff. And they don't like flappers. Now, what ends the KKK's run, if you will, is there's a guy named David Stevenson, who's the head of the KKK, the Grand Wizard, and he wants to be president. So he will run in the primaries to become president. What they find out eventually is that he had two problems, really big problems, besides being the head of the KKK. One was that he was an alcoholic. Now, the KKK was pushing prohibition, and the group is supposed to be pro-family, prohibition, we respect women, that kind of stuff. The other thing they found out is that he had kidnapped a woman, raped her multiple times, and then she ended up dying, and that they dropped her off on her parents' porch before she died. So, yeah. So when the leader of the KKK, who's really branding themselves during this era as being really moral and pro-American and pro-woman and in favor of prohibition, when you find out that he's an alcoholic rapist who essentially killed a woman, causes a problem. He'll eventually go to jail, even though he bribed an entire jury and a judge and the legal system in Illinois. He'll eventually go to jail. I think he ends up at Alcatraz. I think so. But there are books about that as well, kind of weird books. And I saw a movie about it, which was pretty sad. So, but KKK was really big. And he's the runner-up, I suppose, to the Democratic primary nomination for president. And at that point, they go like, no, he's too much. So, and the KKK, primarily in the South, Democrats In the Midwest, probably Democrats and Republicans. So no single party really has a hold on the KKK. However, it tends to be more Democrats than Republicans during this era. And that'll change later, but neither party wants to claim them. So, all right, I have a feeling this is a good place to stop for a variety of reasons. One, my throat hurts. And two, this will give us a chance to talk a little more specifically about the NAACP and the Harlem Renaissance next time. And we can also talk about causes of the Great Depression. So that'll be a nice list of topics for us to discuss. So I think I will stop the recording, but don't leave just yet, okay?